We go next. A little earlier, I spoke to the Conservative peer and former immigration minister in the 1990s, Timothy Kirkhope, and I asked what he made of the situation that the Home Secretary has found herself in.
Well, I think it's a situation that's been developing for quite a while, actually. And one of our problems, I suppose, in this country now is resources. If I take a look at the situation I was in charge of back in the 90s, it was a totally different immigration and asylum situation. We didn't have the kind of pressures that we've got now. But in a way, we are the authors of our own misfortune. And one of the reasons for that, of course, is that we're no longer members of the EU, where the Dublin Agreement, which I was involved in drafting, was an arrangement whereby we could return people to a safe country in Europe from where they had come. So we were able to quickly remove people from this country. Our resources to actually remove them now have not been increased sufficiently, and we're actually not returning people who are illegal immigrants to the countries where they came from. And I think that there's a whole lot of issues here. It is very, very complex. I don't envy the Home Secretary or indeed the Immigration Minister for the roles that they're playing at the moment. Frankly, it's an extremely difficult situation. But I do think that we, frankly, should be doing more than we are in order to deal with it.
What are the intriguing things about Suella Braverman as her approach to lots of different issues? She talks about wanting to cut taxes, a smaller state. But of course, if you do all of that, there's less money to spend on the problems that we are now seeing, both, her refusal to sign off, it seems, on taxpayers' money to fund hotels. But then also, the reason they're needing their hotels is because they don't have the staff in Manston and other places to process people, and they don't have the resources to send them back. So it's a sort of weird dichotomy. The people most keen to sort the wheat from the chaff, if you like, and send back those people who have no right to be here, were also the people least keen on spending public money on doing just that.
Yeah, well, the last thing I want to do is to inflate the profits of hotel companies. And frankly, we're going to spend the money. We shouldn't be spending it on the hotels. We should be spending it on our own staff and our own resources that we need to actually deal with asylum applications quickly, and where they fail, to remove people quickly from the country. I think everybody would regard that as a very fair approach. I've always been on immigration. I believed I was the one that introduced the term firm but fair. And I think that's always the way in which Britain should act in relation to people who apply either for asylum or want to come here as immigrants. The difficulty we've got now, though, is that we're not actually following through on the sort of scheme, as it should be followed through on. We seem to be getting distracted into areas where actually the lack of resources is becoming magnified. And the public, I think, are getting a bit fed up with this.
And in terms of, it seems that Suella Braverman's solution, certainly in the House of Commons yesterday, was to crank up the rhetoric to try and move attention away from the detail, describing what was happening as an invasion on the South Coast. Do you think she's right to use that language? No,
I don't. I mean, actually, the thing is, I said firm but fair. I think fairness also includes the way in which we actually, shall we say, deal with immigration. It's got to be seen to be fair, but also it's got to be seen to be compassionate where it's appropriate. We always had a situation when I was minister, a large proportion of people who claimed asylum in this country, and most of them arrived by air, actually, in those days, or in trucks, backs of trucks. God knows how they got here, but they didn't come across the channel in this way they're doing now. But we used to look at those cases, and a fair proportion of them, a lot of them, did not meet the United Nations. This is the Refugee Convention of 51. Those criteria, which are quite clear as to when you should grant asylum. A lot of them did not. But we had an arrangement then. I don't know idea whether they have it now, but we allowed leave to remain for people who perhaps hadn't quite met those criteria, but we felt we should be sympathetic towards and help. And I think that flexibility was very important. The only problem is that I suspect now that leave to remain is kind of the application we're making in many cases. We're not actually, because we don't have the resources and staff and the speed that's necessary to deal with real asylum applications, we, I think, are missing the fact that there are an awful lot of people still who do not meet the criteria and, I'm afraid, have got to be returned. We're not doing that. And I just think we should just follow the book, as it were. And if we did that, I think the public would be sympathetic to us. And I think that, carrying people with us is the big thing here, including all the minority communities in the country and so on, all those commentators. We need to take people with us on this. We do not want to alienate people by using rhetoric or indeed by using approaches which are regarded as being very, very hard and unfair.
And I suppose there's a real risk here that if you crank up the rhetoric without either the means or the willingness to tackle the problem, then potentially you open up a whole can of worms. The public say, well, we're being invaded, and what are you doing about it? But it turns out not very much. And, to some extent, the Home Secretary's writing checks that she can't cash, that she's unable or unwilling to deliver on the problem. And then you potentially open us up to, possibly major political turmoil. We have seen the decline of UKIP and the BNP over recent years. But if the government cracks up the rhetoric and doesn't tackle the problem, we could be in a real mess.
Well, I mean, obviously UKIP and all those parties were a load of hot air anyway. We know that. But of course, hot air can sometimes have an impact on people's thinking. I opposed in the House of Lords. I spoke quite strongly against the Rwanda scheme, which I think is a lot of nonsense and an expensive nonsense too. It also seems to me to be pretty illegal, really, internationally. It doesn't do anything to enhance our reputation. And of course, part of this problem is that we really have to work with others. We can't just be alone, even though we're not in the European Union and we're not benefiting from some of the things we had then. I think the very least is that we ought to work in a way which earns us some respect from other countries and who are all part of this whole question. I mean, the French and the Germans, the Italians particularly, have taken vast numbers of asylum seekers into their countries. The French keep getting criticized. It's an easy line to say it's all the fault of the French about this channel business. But the truth is that the French have an enormous pressure on them and have taken substantially larger numbers of asylum seekers than we have, and at the same time are very willing to help us to deal with our particular issue. But I think we have to be generous in our attitudes towards them as well, and it works that way. And I'm afraid that sort of post-Brexit, we seem to have got ourselves into a situation where, frankly, we are British and everybody else is, shall we say, less than good.
Just finally, do you think Suella Braverman can or should remain as Home Secretary?
I've got no comment on her at all, I'm afraid. That's entirely a matter for the Prime Minister and everybody else. All I would say is that this is the job that she has, the Home Secretary job, and indeed immigration, is probably the most sensitive area of politics that we're in. And it's going to be for a long time in the future. And therefore, I think the person handling it has to be, shall we say, at least aware of that and realize that some of the words that are being used at the moment are simply not acceptable.
Lord Kirkhope, Timothy Kirkhope, thanks so much for joining us on Times Radio this morning.